It has been said that average people want you to stay average. Welcome to the Breaking Average podcast, the podcast designed to challenge you to break the mold that average has on the world. Each episode offers insights directly from those who choose to break average every day. Now, for the latest insights, here are your hosts, Paul Gustafson and Mike Harber.
Welcome to the Breaking Average podcast. Today is episode 22. My name is Mike Harber, and I'm here today with my co-host, Paul Gustafson. Hey, Paul, how are you, my friend?
Mike, fantastic to be here with you today. Just really enjoy these moments and times to really kind of unpack some stuff here in terms of breaking average and the critical factors. And so it's going to be fun today.
Yeah, it's been really good to go through the book in kind of a mastermind format on our podcast here, Paul, and learn from Diane and Rick and the different perspectives from our authors as well. We're going to continue to dive into those 7 critical factors to team strong leadership from your book, Paul, the Breaking Average book. So why don't you talk to us about that a little bit before we dive into too much further?
Yeah, and I appreciate the compliments on as my book, but it's really not my book. Really, it's a reflection. I would say, obviously there's some contributing authors to it. And it really reflects, I think, a lot of research beyond me to kind of highlight what it takes to break average. 7 critical factors, as you mentioned. We're going to focus on factor number 3 today, and we're going to have a lot of fun with that.
Yeah, Paul, the third factor may be the most important. It's why we're here on the Breaking Average podcast, right? You want to know what we're going to talk about today, Paul? You need this a lot in your life, right? You did it in this book, collaborating with others. And it's a key factor to breaking average. We all want to operate sometimes. And I know for me, look, I'm a solopreneur, right? So we like to operate sometimes as lone rangers, but I'm more successful when I have others to learn from and get ideas from. And so if we don't collaborate, we won't always end up where we want to go. So today we're going to dive into the 3 elements of collaboration. Over the next 3 episodes, we'll talk more about them. And we hope our listeners will take some notes, learn along with us. But Paul, before we go any further, why don't you set us up in this chapter with the story you told from the book?
Yeah, I love this story. We are all focused on stories. I think stories really affect us, at least for me. I would imagine most of our listeners. When you hear a good story, we kind of put ourselves into that story. And I hope to be able to do that today, just in this short bit on this story. So 75 years ago, although none of us are 75 years old, but imagine if you could jump back in the DeLorean 75 years. And there's a restaurant that kind of opens up, and it's called the Dwarf House, right? And that restaurant would change everything that we know today. Now, there's really not many restaurants called the Dwarf House today, but in 1964, this is like 18 years after they start, on their menu, it's just like steaks and burgers and all those kind of things. And he doesn't do much. The owner of the place doesn't do much with chicken, but he gets an overstock of chicken, like a sweet deal on it. And he was like, well, what am I going to do with all these chickens? All right. So he figures out what to do with all these chicken breasts. He fillets them, creates a sandwich out of it. And folks at the Dwarf House just love it. Well, lo and behold, 20 years later, he takes that same idea, the chicken sandwich, and he makes it his number 1 menu item for a brand new restaurant called Chick-fil-A. It's a fantastic story because what you see in the unpacking of that story from Dwarf House to Chick-fil-A is just a continuous improvement process of how to get better. And part of that getting better part was all about collaboration. So early on, they go to Disney. They're like, okay, how do we do this? So they go to Disney, and Rick probably will love this part, right? And they approach them and say, okay, what do we do? How do we manage people better? And they learn that leading by example. Leading by example is a storyline that always delivers tangible results. And you can see that, right? If any of you guys go to Chick-fil-A, you could probably see that in the owner operator or in the employees. They're always leading by example. And it's pretty powerful. And what they discover is 2 things happen, right? When you lead by example, again, that's a storyline that always delivers. You get increased behavior and increased productivity. Two key factors there: increased behavior, increased productivity. And obviously, breaking average is about both those things, right? We want increased behavior and productivity, but you want chemistry. And I call it Chick-fil-A chemistry, right? And I love what Dan Cathy, who is now the CEO of Chick-fil-A, his father, Truett Cathy, was the one who created Dwarf House. He says culture is reflected by demonstrating the behaviors that your team values. You have to teach this, he says. You have to teach this and model this to your team. And so I went and looked at those values, guys, really powerful. There's 5: customer first, personal experience, continuous improvement, working together, and stewardship. And so all of those matter. They all kind of tie into collaboration. I would say working together is probably the one that really resonated with me, at least tied to this topic, this factor of collaboration. And there's so much there. So I would say the communication, the collaboration, it's central to Chick-fil-A. It's a great story. There's a whole lot more to this story that we unpack in the book itself. But I think it sets the table for today. What do you think, Mike?
Yeah, I love that. I love this idea of stories, Paul. I was just in a community. I don't know if you've ever heard of Hot Springs, Arkansas. Maybe some of you had, but it's kind of a famous town. I was there yesterday. My sister lived in Hot Springs, and we were there doing some work in that community yesterday. And we after we finished, my brother-in-law and I stopped. We stopped to eat at this place called McClard's Barbecue. Maybe you've heard of McClard's. Bill Clinton once made a bet while he was president. And, if the Razorbacks won a national title or if they lost, he would, he bet McClard's Barbecue is what his bet was. So it's kind of famous for that. But this place is I don't know how old the restaurant is. It's got to be 100 years old. But Hot Springs is kind of known back in the day as like mafia town, right? Lots of mafia, lots of gangster type activity. There's a horse track there. But I was I had to go to the restroom. I won't get into details about that, but I had to go to the restroom. And I was just thinking when I was it's just one of those old places, right? I mean, the light switch kind of comes out of the ceiling, and when I was in the restaurant, I was thinking, man, what are the stories that could be told in this restaurant? That, because they got all these pictures of the old cars and some of the old, movie stars and people that have visited the restaurant. But I did not know that about Chick-fil-A, Paul, and the Dwarf House. So thanks for sharing that until you read that book. I'm a big fan of Chick-fil-A always, but we can get stories from those places, right? And learn from them and kind of carry us forward. So I'm excited to learn more about that. You've got me intrigued a little bit more. I want to bring our co-host in today, though, Rick Morris and Diane Kane. Hey, Diane, how are you this morning? I'm great. I had visions up here, living in the Northeast and the mafia conversations. If you go to Boston, the stories. Yeah, I can only imagine. And Rick, how about you, my friend?
Doing great. And so, Hot Springs is the birthplace of Clinton, right? I learned that. And I know you get fuzzy on these details, and somehow I can always bring it back to football. But the infamous bet was Clinton versus Gore, because Gore is a Tennessee fan and Clinton beat it. And the infamous Clint Sterner fumble is what caused Clinton to have to pay that bet. So fantastic story.
Yeah, I forgot that. Well, I wasn't going to correct Rick. Because he messed up on the birthplace of Bill Clinton, but since he had to bring that up. He grew up in Hot Springs, but he was born in a community called Hope, Arkansas, which is really the real story. But and now his trailer, his library is in Little Rock. That's kind of a joke. It looks like a big double wide trailer the way they built it, but it's kind of funny. But that's the bet, Rick. And here you are today with your Tennessee Volunteer jacket on, that without even knowing that we were going to bring that up. So thanks for reminding me of that historic loss that we had against Tennessee to help you guys win the national title. So Diane, I want to get us moving into the chapter on collaboration and 3 elements. Why don't you kind of take us that direction before we get too deep into football now?
Into football, got to rein y'all back in all the time. I love how everything's in threes when we're going through all of these chapters. So when we're talking the three critical factors of collaboration, it first starts with communication. And how does that happen? And the collaboration really happens first when there's a commitment to communicate by the leader. And I love, Paul, the example that you were talking about, because it's always modeling that. And so if we're going to communicate, the leader actually has to make that commitment to go first and do it often. And it's really about the transparency of where we're at. The second one is cooperation. The four of us are cooperating on a regular basis, usually, for the most part, except for when Mike has to keep poking at Rick just because we have to have some fun. And collaboration happens when there's a spirit of cooperation that's modeled by the contributors and by the team. And, fun is always part of that cooperation factor. And then the last part is the interaction. And collaboration happens when there's a common desire for the team to interact. And, that takes time. We have to make sure that we're creating the space and the time to be able to have those interactions and making sure that we can pull the best out of each other. We'll get a little bit more into that as we go through the three critical factors today.
Yeah, and normally I pick up here and share a quote, but with communication, we talk about how important is it really, right? How important is communication today? And so I did what I like to do is I looked at some statistics and I found some interesting ones. It says that 97% of workers believe that communication impacts their tasks every day. That it's an everyday thing. It's not just communicating a vision once, but it's an everyday thing. 28% of employees cite poor communication as the reason for not being able to deliver their work on time. But this one was pretty impactful to me. It says miscommunication as a whole costs companies with 100 employees on average $420,000 per year.
Dang.
Wow. And if you think about that, that's rework, that's missed deadlines, that's missed commitments to customers, that's cost of revenue. And that's a pretty broad statistic, but it's interesting just to try to even slice that on what poor communication actually does. Think about extra meetings because things went awry and the cost of those meetings, that kind of stuff. But employees who feel that their voice is heard in the workplace and they feel like the communication is a two-way street, they're almost 5 times more likely to feel empowered to deliver their best work. And so communication is not just us communicating to our teams and making sure that everybody's clear on what we're supposed to do, which saves money. It's just as important to have that communication be a two-way street so that teams are empowered to deliver real results.
Rick, I love the statistics that you just shared. I had not seen these before, and I've seen evidence of this in businesses and organizations, and I can see, let's be honest, right? Every one of us at some point in time fail in our communication. We struggle. And when we do, we see the net effect of that, we look at it and we realize, wait a minute, I could have done something better there. I could have communicated a little bit more effectively. I could have avoided that little mini disaster that just took place. And so we want to give you guys tools to be able to support you in communication. So we're going to ask you guys, go over to our website, go to breakingaverage.com, check it out there. We've got some resources to help you communicate better, be more effective in your communication, clarifying that. And we're going to unpack more here, obviously, in this podcast, but we invite you just to go over to breakingaverage.com, check it out, and let us know. We've got some links there for you to tell us a little bit more about what you're doing. So.
Yeah, Paul, you've written some pretty good blog posts over on that website recently to help give people other tools outside of what we're doing on the Breaking Average podcast as well. So highly recommend you hit the website, get some more tools and access to those things that Paul's sharing as well. Also, we want to highlight our sponsor for our podcast today. Rick, we have a cool sponsor. You want to tell us a little bit about today's sponsor?
Well, we have a pretty amazing person that's sponsoring today. We all are a huge fan of her. We've gotten to highlight her through Breaking Average. She's certainly a collaborator on the book as well. And our sponsor for today's episode is none other than, and she was the overall DNA award winner. For those of you that don't follow the John Maxwell team, we have these culture awards, which are people that really exemplify the DNA of what it means to be a John Maxwell team member. And 30,000 coaches out there, 35,000 people are technically eligible. And she was the overall winner last year, and that's Dr. Gloria Burgess. You can visit her at gloriaburgess.com. She's got phenomenal stories, tons of experience to help you out. And she really does a great job on the power of collaboration. So you can check out this amazing short video that she has. It's on the bottom of her homepage, which again is Gloria Burgess, and that's BURGESS.com. And also, if you get a chance to see that video, you can see her husband, who's an incredible maestro, and he's in the video as well. So connect with her on LinkedIn. And don't forget also, she's written an amazing book called Pass It On. Phenomenal stories in the book. You can find that on Amazon and, of course, at gloriaburgess.com.
Two of my favorite people, but for the John Maxwell team, the four of us may never have met one another, right? But for the John Maxwell team, I never would have met Gloria and John, her husband, as well. So a beautiful couple, sweet as they can be, complimentary. When I think of the people that I really admire, it's people who compliment others. And just really love others. I wish I was better at that myself. There are two people that really do that well. So I'm glad that we had an opportunity to highlight them today. In the book, Breaking Average, it says we must communicate well, right? We're talking about communication. So we want to kind of transition in our conversation around this portion of the book. What does it really mean to communicate? And then why does it matter? I love those statistics, Rick. I'd love, when we kind of come back to you mentioned that on average, if a company that has 100 employees loses 400 and something thousand a year. Is that an average per 100 or just for a company that has 100 or more?
Yeah. So the way the study ran is they looked at overall losses that were attributed to communication. And that's a little bit broad, right? Like how do you come back and go, well, it was communication that caused this loss? But they did a pretty broad study across small business, large business, came up with the amount of money that company was attributing to that business and then averaged that out over time. Those are hard to pull, but I think it's important. I run a statistic of a personal study that I did around the cost of meetings. And show that literally with a standard 300 person company, we waste about $1.1 million in meetings where key decisions weren't made. And how we attribute that is literally in the meetings, just checking a box on each agenda item whether or not this is a meeting that a key decision was made. And it's pretty simple to calculate the cost of meetings based on salary. As a matter of fact, if you go to pdware.pro, I wrote the calculator that I used to do this study with to determine how much are meetings costing you and can we be more effective and efficient in communication. But why communication is so important to me is communication and collaboration are important because it's inspiring, it's motivating, but it comes back to a key word for me. And it's something that I've really focused in on. And that's also the word, it's one of our favorites that we discuss. It's authenticity. Mm-hmm. Right. And you ever find somebody, there's thousands of speakers. There's always these amazing books, right? We reference books all the time. You read a book like Breaking Average. And let's even talk about like Dr. Gloria Burgess for a moment. When you get empowered and motivated, inspired by words, and then you meet the person and you find out that they were truly authentic. Mm-hmm. Like that person lives and breathes the values. Why is Chick-fil-A so important, in what they're doing? It's because of the way that they instill the values. They don't just say we believe in these values. Like there's workshops and there's courses and you've got to prove your mettle before you become an owner operator. And then that translates all the way down to that experience in the drive-through that you're having as a customer. It's all based on authenticity. It's not just saying we want somebody to say they believe in these values. We want people who authentically walk in these values. But I think the reverse is true as well. And I've experienced this multiple times in my life where I heard a message or was inspired or just saw somebody who's like, man, I want to get to know that person. And then you find out that it's smoke and mirrors, that the authenticity isn't there. And it's funny because when I hear that same message again delivered by that same person, I'm like, meh. It's like, I don't even believe you anymore because there's no authenticity behind it, because I found out that they speak the values, they don't believe in the values. So I think communication is so important, but it's got to be authentic to who you are. That's the only way. If communication is going to drive business results, authentic communication drives lasting results.
So right on. And I love that you brought up authenticity again, Rick, because that's one of the things that I was talking about comes back to me all the time. How do you actually make that connection? How does that communication come through? And making that safe space on top of it too, right? So when we're talking communication and the leaders modeling the communication and has made that commitment to be transparent, bringing that transparency in and seeing that transparency again, the authenticity and the transparency are the two are sisters, really, right? You can't have one without the other. And one of the things that came to me recently was, live to lead is one of the things that comes with the John Maxwell team, or what we participate in. And Alan Mulally was talking about it. And he was talking about the project management. We keep coming back to it because that's where you live. And we were talking about the red, the yellow, and the green, right? And how in Ford's environment, red was a curse. You didn't really ever have the conversation that the project's really going off the rails. And let's tie that back to those numbers, right? The miscommunication, really, the project's going off the rails. I should have it in this red status that, hey, something's not really working. And how many times within Ford's culture, they kept it green because you were going to be crucified if you didn't. It wasn't safe to really report the truth. And when Mulally came in and took over and actually had somebody say the truth and speak the truth and give and celebrate bringing the truth to the table, I wonder how much they saved in actually reporting the truth, right?
Millions, guaranteed.
Exactly. Right. And so I think that's so important, is to celebrate when we're actually speaking the truth. And sometimes the truth is hard to hear too, when that communication aspect. And so,
yeah,
I'm going to kick it back over to you.
No, that's good. I love the Alan Mulally story. And, we don't know how much is saved through effective communication, right? We know we can calculate how much gets lost, but boy, how much more can be gained when you effectively communicate. And I want to kind of go back to this Chick-fil-A story, guys. I'm getting hungry just thinking about it, to be honest with you. But Chick-fil-A. So a couple years ago, after an IMC, we were all down in Orlando. And some of you guys may remember this, some may not. But Chick-fil-A had their big operators event at the Marriott. And I connected with Mark Miller, who was one of our guests on Breaking Average. Go back and make sure you watch that and watch that podcast. Listen to that. It's really good. But I get a chance to connect with Mark while he's there, and they're setting up shop. And the communication model, talk about authenticity. Right. So they're there to communicate to the operators, but you could see it even before the event and the pre-event piece and the communication that was happening. And then the focus of what they had for that event itself was on the communication that they're going to have within the communities where they serve. 2,400 stores across the country. They bring in every single operator, a representative, sometimes two, right, to that event at the Orlando Marriott. And it's all about communication. What a massive undertaking. But that communication, that was key to the whole event, and communication with team members, operators, customers, members in the community. That was the focus. And Mark was sharing that and unpacking that. And I got a little bit of a taste of that and really impressed. Right. And here's the thing, Dan Cathy was there at that event. At IMC, and he actually, they pulled him off as they were preparing. I don't know if you guys remember this.
Yeah.
John Maxwell was saying, "Hey, Dan, can you share a few words to our team?" And Dan said, "Well, I don't have anything prepared, but sure." And John says, just share what you shared with your team. And so that's what Dan did. And Dan says, communication isn't what you say, it's what you do. It isn't what you say, it's what you do. Leadership is 80% what you do, 20% what you say. So if you take those two things, right? What do you have? You've got culture and chemistry. That's what you get out of that. That's the magic of communication. And that gets me all excited. So, Mike, what are your thoughts on that? Because I know you're getting hungry too.
We're talking about McLeod's barbecue and Chick-fil-A today. It's it's the food show instead of the Breaking Average podcast, right? George Bernard Shaw said one time the biggest problem with communication is to think that it's occurred, right, or something to that effect. And so many people, so many leaders, even on our podcast, we have to make sure that we're communicating, right? And one of my favorite movies to watch, I've probably watched it, 50 times, is Rush Hour with Jackie Chan and Chris Tucker. I don't know if y'all have ever seen that movie, but in the very first one, Jackie Chan comes down the stairs of the airplane, and Chris Tucker meets him at the bottom of the stairs, and he starts talking to him, and he says, "Can you understand the words coming out of my mouth?" Yeah. And it's a classic scene. I'll use it sometimes when I'm doing communication workshops or something, and that's the problem a lot of times with communication is we think that we've said something, or we think that people have heard us just because words are coming out of our mouth, right? And that's not really what communication is. That's why I love John Maxwell's book, Everyone Communicates, Few Connect, right? It's really about connecting with people. And that's what collaborating is. In order for me to collaborate with others, I've got to find ways to connect. Rick and I connect around sports, right? We connect around SEC sports, especially, but SEC football a lot. There's a connection point there. So it allows us to communicate. Paul and I connect around, books that we like to read and getting more out of the information that we have so that we can share it with others. Diane and I have a connection around, our kids, the grandkids that she has, and, just kind of that familial aspect. So there's connection points that we have to look for in order to collaborate with others. And that's what's so important about communication. That's why it's important not just to have words come out of our mouth, but to really connect with someone else so that you can collaborate with them and move things forward. Paul, you started a chapter of this book. In this book, the chapter out with a quote says, "Unity is strength. Where there is teamwork and collaboration, wonderful things can be achieved." Here's the scary part of that. The opposite's also true, right? When there is no communication, when there is no collaboration, we get stuck. Nothing great is ever achieved. Like if we weren't communicating, I'll just use us four as an example. If we weren't communicating and collaborating effectively, this podcast wouldn't move forward, right? It wouldn't. Somebody would be doing it by themselves. Rick would have nothing to edit. Right. We would have nothing to talk about. I mean, there's a lot of behind the scenes communication and collaboration that go on. So we, as leaders, we have to, if we want to break average, as leaders, as organizations, as a society, we've got to learn to collaborate. We've got to learn to communicate more effectively. We can just look around our world right now and see the breakdowns in communication and a lack of collaboration as well. So we could go deeper into that. I could probably talk about an hour or so because I'm so passionate about, becoming a better communicator because I grew up in such dysfunction where there was no communication. I think it's important. So, but let's transition. How do we cultivate? Right. So it's not enough just talk about how important it is, but how do we really cultivate this idea of communication for the people that we work with? Dan, I want you to get us started on that side.
Yeah. And, when we talk about communication, really, there's kind of no such thing as too much communication. I think that's what happens a lot of times when we're in organizations. Sometimes we need to make sure that we check.
Hey, Diane, did you just say there's no such thing as there are people I know that communicate too much? Like I've heard enough of them, right?
I was going to jump in on that one too because I've been in these meetings with these huge companies where you have the pre-meeting before the meeting, pre-meeting before you meet with the customer. You'll have 11 meetings before you ever talk to the customer. So I'm sorry, I'm going to take on that side too.
I'm sorry, I had to jump in on that.
All right, well, let me clarify what I mean. Over communicating our values and where we're going and the vision.
Yeah.
Yes, productive conversations. Let's make sure that we're talking productive conversations. Thank you both for jumping in on that one. But back to we've talked about it before too. When we're talking communication, is understanding the styles. If you're an effective leader and you really want to have great communication and collaboration, we need to have it. And DISC is my jam, right? We talk about DISC and the behavioral profiles and all of that. But I really always look at it through the lens of how we communicate. And a lot of times in meetings, sometimes the greatest nuggets will always come from the person that you're drawing it out from. You need to make sure that we're having that space, that we're not always filling the silence, because the silence is where the processing is happening, right? And letting the individual who appears to be quiet, who's thinking things through, pause. And even make sure that there's the opportunity to come back after the meeting. So sometimes there needs to be the meeting after the meeting, because the nuggets have come after you've marinated a little bit. And I think that that's really, really important, to be able to create that two-way conversation, that space, and then always come back to what did we talk about and what came out of that. And Rick, what are your thoughts on that with the too many meetings?
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Way too many meetings sometimes. But I think it's amazing how many miscommunications occur because of the assumption of what questions mean. And this was like my career pre-DISC. Before I really understood how to communicate to the different styles, I had a very high C boss, very, very high C boss. And, he just said, hey.
And not the drink.
Yeah, exactly. He said, I remember I came in, I was running this multi-million-dollar account, and I was a young leader. And he said, hey, how's everything going? I said, it's going good. And about, 20 minutes later, he says, come into my office. And he goes, why didn't you tell me about this issue, that, right? And he's just berating me on issues. I was like, because they're all handled, right? We're already in progress in the fixes. And he's like, well, I need to know everything. And for some reason, I always flash back to Airplane on that, by the way, when somebody goes, yeah, I want to know everything. Well, first the earth cooled, and then the dinosaurs came. But like, how much do you really need to know, right? So I was a little frustrated. And then I had two managers at the time. So I had my technology manager, my sales manager. My sales manager comes in, she goes, how's everything going? And so I'm like, well, here's this issue. About 20 minutes later, I get called into my boss's office again. And he's like, well, she doesn't feel like you're on top of everything. And I was like, good gracious, like, what do I do? And I just learned a technique that I teach a lot, is to qualify the question. And so to play that out later, it's like 6 months later, and I'm taking over this project, and the CIO, who I'm meeting for the first time, comes onto the elevator, and he says, how's it going? And I said, do you want to know that I'm just on top of the issues, or would you like to know a list of the issues that I'm working? So I hadn't met him yet. And he paused and he looked at me and he goes, I don't know. He said, I was just making a greeting. He goes, but who are you? And I said, well, I'm Rick Morris. I'm here taking over this account. And he goes, well, come into my office tomorrow. And we had a great first impression and wonderful conversation. And I caught him up. And then I asked him, like, when you ask me questions like that, what are you anticipating? What are you expecting? And that has become a practice of mine, of when somebody asks me a question, to qualify the answer that they want to hear. Right? What is the information you really want to hear, so I understand how you're asking me questions, so I can be most effective in communicating back to you? And that's just something I've taken with me in my career ever since.
I love that, Rick.
Good stuff, guys. I love that, qualifying the question. I think asking the right questions, guys, is probably the most critical thing we can do as leaders. You don't have to be a leader, like a positional leader. We're all leaders in different capacity. But when we ask those right questions, those qualifying questions, it changes the game. One, it allows that other person to feel like they're being understood. That's critical, right? So if we're just barking instructions and orders and shouting out what it needs to be done or what we're trying to do and all those things, okay, that's communicating, but is it effective communicating, right? But if I'm asking questions, if I'm sharing values, if I'm mapping to those values, and I can cast my vision based on those values, that makes a big difference. The key is, and Diane, you mentioned the pause. And that's so important, right? That listen element. 2 ears, one mouth. 2 ears, one mouth. So there's a reason why God created us with 2 ears and one mouth. And maybe we should use that as a ratio on that, right? And it makes a big difference when that other person's feeling like they're seek to understand before being understood. You guys have heard that, right? Yeah. That's effective communication. Like, hey, I want folks to understand something, but I need to understand them first. Right. So if we listen, we ask those questions, we listen, then we can respond. and we can add those kind of thoughts into it. So love where we're going with this, Mike. This is really good.
Yeah, it is. I love this topic around communication because I just think it's the number one issue, right? That we have in our world, that we have in leadership. I think to really cultivate this idea of collaboration and communication in our teams is, we have to care first. I'm a huge John Maxwell fan. I learned leadership really from John. I study a lot of other people now and learn a lot of different things, but it was in John's book, 21 Irrefutable Laws of Leadership, that I really began to understand some of these ideas, like the law of connection, right? Touch a person's heart before you ask for a hand. That's where we begin to build trust, and trust is the foundation of communication. Really, it's the foundation of leadership. The only way you can do that is as Diane talked about earlier, she used the term authenticity. I like transparency a little bit. Be as transparent as you can as a leader. You can't always share everything as a leader, because timing and those kind of things. But to build trust, you've got to be as transparent as possible. I like the three words that I think really help cultivate this idea of collaboration with others. Number one, visibility. As a leader, you have to be visible. The number one mistake leaders make is going into their office and staying there and hoping people either come to them or don't come to them at all, right? They stay invisible. So you can't build trust without visibility. And then authenticity, similar to transparency. I think authenticity and transparency are a little bit different. I've got to come from it from my heart. Transparency to me is sharing what I can. Authenticity is sharing from my heart. And so I think you have to be authentic in your communication with others. And then the key is consistency. Be consistent in who you are, what you communicate, how you communicate. I think if you practice those three things, visibility, authenticity, consistency, then you'll be able to cultivate this idea of collaboration. And Paul, you probably know the quote from Andy Stanley. He said something about when people quit communicating with you, then you're not a leader or something like that. I can't remember exactly what it is when you if you know the quote.
You're putting me on the spot, so I can't remember on the moment.
It just came to me, so I can't remember it.
But it's so he makes a great point in terms of how do you be an effective leader? You've got to be able to share those values. You've got to be able to connect at their level. The important to know what everybody's roles and responsibilities are. Part of the communication is to ourselves. Part of it is knowing, okay, what is it that's my responsibility. And as a leader, we get to help people cultivate and ask them those questions like, okay, what do you feel is the most important thing that you can do to be able to support this mission? And that allows people to kind of buy in, which gets into our second factor next week that we'll be kicking around.
Yeah. I wish I could remember that quote. We'll have to look that up. It's so good, but it just kind of popped in my head. I know it's from Andy Stanley. I just couldn't find it real quick. So again, visibility, authenticity, consistency. We've had some great discussion around this topic of communication. I love this. This may be one of my most favorite chapters in the book, other than the one I kind of helped co-author as well, because I think it requires both. We'll get into that one later.
That one soon.
Paul, why don't you talk to us about our sponsor?
This is so much fun. We have a passion, guys, a passion for communication. This is so critical. The breaking average thing, it's real. We feel like it's too easy to settle for average, and we want to help you break average. And if you can just take a little bit more time doing this is so important. We want to remind you of our sponsor today, Gloria Burgess. Guys, I got to share this with you. Gloria, she spoke at our recent Imagineering event. We have this one day a year where we want to make sure that we're communicating effectively, hearing them as well as them hearing our thoughts. And we brought in Gloria as our keynote speaker, and she did a fantastic job. She shared a message of collaboration. We called it was connections. That was our theme, a message on connection. And she shared the story of her father and her father meeting William Faulkner. And she shares a little bit about that, obviously in her book, Pass It On. But the way she shared that story, boy, it touched the heart. It touched the heart. And those stories matter. That's a way to connect, by the way. But again, we ask you to just check out Gloria and what she offers. She's here to help you as well. We're just honored that she was a contributing author. Just go to gloriaburgess.com and check out some of the information that she's got there that Rick mentioned. So, yeah.
Yeah, good. Thank you, Gloria, for being a sponsor of the show. I want to just kind of move into our tip and challenge for the week, Paul, and I think this has been a great discussion. We need to dive deeper into communication. Maybe we could do a show just on communication and use some examples. I know we're going to be diving deeper into the next two elements of this chapter over the next couple of weeks. But what's your tip and challenge for us this week, Paul?
Yeah, this has been great. And Diane, Rick, thanks for all the inputs that you guys have had today, and just love interacting with you, right? Because when you think about communication, it's about interaction. Participation without fellowship is just a transaction. Participation without fellowship is just a transaction. Mm-hmm. We need to have fellowship. That's what communication is about. When you think about the word community or communicate, it's got two words in it. It's got common and unity. All right. Mm-hmm. Common and unity. All right. And you guys can look it up. You know what those words mean. And Mike talked about finding those common things that we have, that we value and share. What do we have in common? That's a great element. If you want to really connect with your tribe, with your audience, with your family, with your friends, what are those things that you have in common? Leverage those values that you both share in common. That's key. You know, and the Chick-fil-A example is a great example, but there are others. There are others out there. So my challenge for you guys is, what are your values? Take some time to identify what your values are, and take some time to try to understand what other people's values are, and then use those too, right? Understanding the values that you have in common is going to create the opportunity for you to communicate common unity. So what are you doing to share them? Celebrate with them what they're doing. So that's my thought on that. I know you've got another perspective here, Mike, that I want to hear, because we want to be effective in how we communicate. And I think that's another element that I didn't get into.
Yeah, I think for me, Paul, the tip is, if you aren't a good communicator, get better. I mean, there's no excuse to not be a better communicator. And every person I talk to in the organizations that I work with in coaching, training, development, communication is the number one issue. Mm-hmm. You know, Rick shared some cost to poor communication with us earlier. And then so many leaders get promoted into leadership roles from a staff role, right? And they say, when I become a leader, I'm going to do better. But then they don't, because they make excuses, right? So my tip for you is, or maybe it's a tip challenge together, is get better. No, there's no excuse for it. Look, I was a horrible communicator growing up. I grew up in lots of dysfunction where communication was not modeled well in my home. I was scared to death to communicate with others. I've done everything I can to get better. And some people would say, well, Mike, you got a long ways to go. Yeah, I agree. But some things that I did is I started reading. I started watching. I joined a speaker club called Toastmasters to help me learn to just get comfortable speaking in front of others and desensitize myself to the fear of having, stage fright or whatever it may be. So you can do all those kind of things. Just read, study, watch, join a speaking club. Those things right there will help you begin to move yourself forward and become the better communicator that's required to lead others. You can't lead others if you can't communicate with them, for sure.
You know, that reminds me real quick. I've been playing around with Clubhouse. Talk about an effective communication tool, right? Rick, you and I have chatted about it. All four of us have talked about it. I think we need to do something like that. What do you think, Rick?
Yeah, I'm in. I'm seeing people actually record their podcasts on Clubhouse. And I think it's a really cool way to touch the community. And they take a pause about every 15 minutes and then interact with the crowd. But yeah, it's direct communication, and you get again to also potentially hear those values. You know, how do they really communicate behind the curtain of their social media accounts and all these other things that you see? It's pretty cool.
Yeah, and it's definitely an effective way to get better, as Mike suggested in his tip and challenge. So, wow, what a fun episode. Diana, you have added so much value to us just in and just your insights too, and that whole pause thing. Any final thoughts that you wanted to share? Because that pause factor that you hit on one time before in a podcast was so important. Well, can you just hit that? Why is that pause so important?
It's that opportunity of letting those ears kick in a little bit more. It's giving space, right? Yeah. I like to say giving space because for some of us, we process so quickly. A lot of us process so quickly, but I love it when Mike, you asked Paul to pull up a quote and he was like, oh, you put me on the spot, right? And Rick, you brought it up, that I see, right? There are people who are very introverted. The most of us we've got that combination of extrovert, introvert.
Yeah.
And when somebody's very analytical, we need to be able to let them think through, pull all of that information in, and then be able to formulate the thought back out.
Right.
And if that space isn't created, we miss so many opportunities. We just miss so many opportunities and great nuggets that can come from that.
Yeah. That's cool. Guys, this has been so much fun. Mike, thank you so much for leading us today. And we want to thank our sponsor, Gloria Burgess. Gloria, thank you for everything that you do. Hey, guys, we want you to go to our website. Go to breakingaverage.com. If you know an effective communicator or leader, we've got a way for you to be able to share that. We would love to interview them. Just go to breakingaverage.com and just look for the links there to kind of share with us that leader. So, Mike, this has been fun.
Yeah, great conversation today, Paul. Thanks, Diane. Thanks, Rick, for joining us today. I love the topic of communication. I love the book, Breaking Average. Once again, we are inspired by our mission of leadership and breaking average. We hope you'll continue to tune into the Breaking Average podcast. Join us again on the next episode.
Thank you for listening to the Breaking Average podcast. If you loved what you heard, please take a moment to subscribe. All opinions and comments expressed in this podcast are those of the participants and do not reflect the opinions or views of any of the advertisers, producers, or platforms. This show was produced by R2 Multimedia. A special thank you to Milestone Melodies for our theme music. As you continue your day, what is one action that you can apply from this podcast to your life? Tune in for our next episode as we continue to challenge everyone to break average.